Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for coming today. And thank you, panelists. I'm very excited about this panel discussion we're going to do today, and it's really nice to see a full house, lots of students. So welcome to the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. My name is Sarah Baldwin. I'm a writer with the Institute. And as Rick said last night, our director, this may seem like an odd venue for a panel on art and activism, but in fact, this event is very, very much aligned with Watson's mission, which is to promote a more peaceful and just world through teaching, research, and public engagement. And two summers ago, when our director, Rick Locke, who was then brand new, took a look around this beautiful building and asked me to find a way to get art on the walls and people in the halls. He wanted this amazing place to come alive, and not just with academics, with the people from the community. So I convened a committee, a very, very hard-working group of staff and faculty, and we began to shape what has become the Art at Watson initiative. A year ago, when I received an email asking if I was interested in bringing dignity to Watson, which if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you do. It's on the second floor. The instant and obvious answer was yes. Watson is filled with people, sociologists, economists, political scientists, anthropologists, who are working very hard to understand the world's problems and to share their understanding with others. But we believe that art, shows like Dignity, for example, can also offer us ways of understanding the world, and art, too, begs to be shared with others. The artists that are convened here today are of a particular breed, those who have merged their medium, or in many cases their media, with their cause, an issue that disturbs them, enrages them, inspires them, excites them. And I'd like to take a minute. I don't know if Christine DiChiara is here. Christina? Oh, great. Thank you so much. Christina's here from the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts, and it's thanks to her that we were put in touch with these great people. Thank you for coming. As I thought about moderating this panel, I said to myself, I'm not an artist. And then I said, well, I'm a writer, and in a very small way, my writing has a mission, and that is creating a space for voice. So while my own writing practice gives me enormous pleasure and even greater pain most of the time, the work I do with other people, whether it's coaxing memoir from senior citizens or creating poetry with teenage girls, or just creating workshops to give people time and space to write, that gives me just as much joy. So I would say that my writing is micro-mission based. So now let me introduce these true artists and kick off what I hope will be a lively discussion. I'm going to be asking them questions. They're going to be asking each other questions, and I will invite you to ask them questions as well. Meredith Stern was born in a small town in Pennsylvania, which I mentioned because so was I. And then she went to Tulane University, where she earned a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Ceramics and also learned to DJ. She's been involved in artistic communities ever since, creating a collectively run bookstore in her front yard in New Orleans, which I would like to hear more about, living with other artists in a warehouse space she dubbed New City, stints in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, both related to art, and finally, lucky for us, she's landed in Providence. She's a former director of AS220, an artist-run organization here in Providence, and she's a member of Just Seeds Artist Cooperative, a decentralized network of 30 artists committed to making print and design work that reflects a radical social, environmental, and political stance. Just Seeds believes in the transformative power of personal expression in concert with collective action. Meredith's work, as far as I can tell, deals with issues such as reproductive rights, gender justice, and in some sense democratizing art, but you can tell us yourself soon enough. You guys are in opposite order. Andrew Mrozek is a photographer and curator, and Juan Jose Barboza Gubo is a painter and a sculptor. And I just realized I was supposed to be showing you their fabulous art. So let's backtrack to Meredith and look at a few images of her work. Linoleum block prints, planting, and that's the Just Seeds Collective. And some very politically charged works. Sorry about that, Meredith. So together, Andrew and Juan concern themselves with issues of equality and inequality based on gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity, specifically empowering the LGBTQ community in Peru, which is much cast aside by the political and religious powers there. They are currently at work on Las Vírgenes de la Puerta, a series of portraits of transgender women in Lima. And in 2014, they produced Los Chicos, a series of photos celebrating young gay men who are defying an oppressive class system and culture of machismo. Anne Fessler's art focuses often on stories of women and the media messages and myths that shape their lives. Her films and installations deal with subjects such as family, rape, and adoption. This last, adoption, is the topic of at least 2 of her films and of a book, The Girls Who Went Away, which was named by Ms. Magazine one of the top 10 feminist books of all time. She also recently received the 2014 Adoptee Trailblazer Award, given to an adult adoptee whose work inspires and instructs professionals in adoption and foster care. This is a trailer from her film called A Girl Like Her. I might never see you again, but.
That's not it.
Nope.
My parents' generation, that greatest generation, that's what they thought. It didn't happen to nice girls, but nice girls do get pregnant.
They called the doctor. The doctor said, well, you send her away to a home for unwed mothers, and she gives the child up, and it'll all blow over.
My mother came and got me and let me stay at home for a few weeks. I was 3 months pregnant, and she said, you don't look it now, but you will soon, and so I want you out of this house. And she said, if you keep your baby, never come back.
You're going to be taken care of, but you're going to have that baby, and you are going to do the only thing that is right, and that is you're going to give this baby to good people, decent people, because you are so bad and so flawed for just having this happen. There's no way you could possibly provide what a child would need.
I just felt like I had done this horrific thing, and I was not in any position to protest or say, you know, what I wanted. Certainly, I wasn't in any position to say, well, is there any way that my baby wouldn't have to be taken? I mean,
People say to me, oh, it's not that way anymore. I said, it's still that way for a lot of us. A lot of my sisters are still suffering.
I don't think people realize how many women lost their babies.
this young woman that they locked away was not allowed to have her voice.
And finally, Dana Gluckstein. In the 1980s, Dana was a commercial photographer, California-based. She was on assignment in Puerto Rico and hopped over to Haiti to do some personal work. And that trip turned out to be the first step in what would become a 3-decades-long quest to photograph indigenous peoples around the world. That work culminated in a book, which you can buy at the Brown Bookstore, and an international exhibit, which we have here. Dana's portrait work includes photos of notables from Ursula Le Guin to Mikhail Gorbachev to Desmond Tutu. With Amnesty International, Dana advocated for the U.S.'s adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. She was keynote speaker at the UN in Geneva, where dignity was exhibited, and at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where she and other artists spoke about improving the state of the world through the arts by shifting mindsets. With Amnesty International USA, she's working on a campaign to end discrimination against and sexual assaults of Native American women and Native Alaskan women. So, an impressive panel. Let's just look at Dana's images, which again, I urge you to look at upstairs. And there's Dana. So I'll just start with some questions and then feel free to take turns. And can you still hear me if I'm over here? I'm not the one who's going to be speaking. I want to start with a question of origin. When did you know you were going to give your life to art? And when did you know you had a cause that animated you? And how did you merge the two? Which did you know what you were first? And I think, Anne, it seems to me you had a triggering event. Could you talk about that to start with?
Okay. It wasn't the beginning of my commitment to using art as a platform to bring people's attention to women's issues, but in 1989 I was at an art opening, and when I walked in I noticed a woman who was really familiar to me, and I couldn't remember her name or where I knew her from. And I asked several people so I can verify that I actually went through this process, and nobody knew who she was. And later she started walking towards me, and everybody's had that experience. You're sort of racking your brain, where do I know this person from? And she walked up to me and with no introduction whatsoever said, "You could be my long-lost daughter. You look like the perfect combination of myself and the father of my child." And I started to have a physical reaction to this, and I was one of those adoptees who just said, "Oh, leave well enough alone, I'm never going to search," I'm not, all that, And so it turned out that, well, I said to her, "I'm an adoptee, you don't know what you're saying, I could be your daughter." And then we are standing there staring at each other. And as it turned out, I was not her daughter, but her daughter was born only a year and a month from my birthday. So this was the first time I'd ever stood face to face with a woman who was the age of my birth mother. And so we started talking, and I started asking her questions, and it was like, it just completely changed my whole understanding. And I was raised by an adoptive mother who herself was an adoptee. So I thought I totally understood adoption, and I thought I totally understood all these feminist issues, and the story she was telling me from her personal experience was not like anything I had ever heard. And so at that moment, and based on the fact that it turns out the reason she was familiar to me was because she was in my dream the night before we met. So, so I knew this was, one of those life-altering events, and from that point on, I just started researching and looking into what other women of her era had experienced, and ultimately collected the oral histories of 100 women who were sort of baby boom generation, who were forced to surrender because of the shame of single pregnancy at the time. And all my work since that time has really been around these issues in one way or another.
But you were already
I was
a
dealing with
filmmaker and-
women's issues. Up through that point, I was doing installations. I was telling other people's stories and artist books and installations. So I was already primed to work that way, but it didn't occur to me to deal with the subject of adoption. And so that shift happened when I met her and learned that. And the more I learned, the more I knew I needed to get the information out, because it just was not known in the general public. It was assumed that any woman who surrendered did so because she didn't want a parent. It seemed simple, but that was not the case.
Thank you. Dana, you talk about this as well, how you had your medium. Well, it was painting first, I believe, and then you found photography, and then suddenly you found that it had a purpose, that you had this purpose.
Well, I'll just give you a little bit of a different answer. How many people were there last evening, or is this a new group? A deeper answer, having been so touched by your story, Anne, is that I grew up in Los Angeles in a very large tribe, a Jewish tribe, and as I started to track the photographic work with indigenous peoples in my 20s, I had to really do some deep pondering why this girl from LA was going to all of these places. And especially when I had to write the Dignity book 25 years later, the artist afterward, what I really discovered is that the stories in my family of the people that we lost in the Holocaust, the family members that dispersed to other countries fleeing the Holocaust, and those survivors that still told their stories at our Passover table moved me deeply. I was steeped in that world, as well as my father's sister who had lupus all through my formative years and died when I was 13. I was extremely close to her, and she was crippled in a body that couldn't move. The whole family would surround themselves together, be weekly, the whole clan there. It was centered around my Auntie Jeanette, and she was my very first profound teacher, that it was the internal radiance, the dignity of the internal human being that was so much more important than the external. And growing up in a place like Los Angeles, that was a very important message, and I think informed my work later on when I discovered photography. So years of doing painting and drawing in high school and at Stanford, and also a degree in psychology and discovering photography, and that seemed to be the perfect merging of all of those insights.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Meredith, what about you? When did you know that you had things to say with your art?
I grew up in a Jewish Quaker environment, and that was also very much fueled by social justice practice. And I guess the first time that I conflated the art and the social justice was I was in 7th grade, and I realized the cafeteria was using plastics and styrofoam, and I thought it was like such an atrocity to the environment that we were doing this, and why didn't we, have reusable dishware? So I made a poster. That was my first poster that had like a picture of the earth, and it was like there was like quotes that I think are comedy because I have no idea where they came from, but it was like, by 2020 the earth will be unsustainable for humans to live in it, and like it takes 1 million years for a plastic spoon to biodegrade, and it's like, how do we even know it takes 1 million years yet?
But was it a good poster?
But so it was a very cool poster, and it was like, sign the petition, get active, and so then I also had a petition that I sent around, and basically just like I realized that if I gave the petition to people slightly more popular than me, that they would get the people more popular than me, and then all of a sudden, like, it could go farther than if it was me just, like, giving the petition. So basically I got enough signatures that I then took it to the principal, and then, a week later or something, we got a report back from the principal, like, we've gotten the, we're talking about it and we're looking into it, and so the plan is to see if we can move forward with this. And then by the time I was in high school, they had transitioned to silverware and plateware, and so I was like, all right, you can do something. But
and it stayed with you after
and so
that?
that stayed with me because it's the most tangible thing that you could see, like the beginning to the end of it. And a lot of social justice and art work, it's less tangible, the results. It's kind of a lot more qualitative than quantitative.
Yeah, sure.
So.
Well, Juan and Andrew, unless you're dying to answer that question, I have one for you, and it's about collaboration. How did your collaboration happen? How did you come together? Was it through the art, or was it around the causes? And how has collaborating changed each of your processes?
Well, I think Juan and I met years ago when he came from Peru. What year?
That was like 14 years ago.
That was like 14 years ago. But I'm only 21. So we had met at one point when he had come to the university that I was working at that time to see if we would potentially be interested in showing his work, and I thought his work was incredible, but it didn't end up panning out. Years later, 5 or 6 years later, we had...
Wait, just for the record,
oh, God.
he didn't show my work.
We got that.
It's awful. But several years later, I saw his thesis show, not even realizing it was him, and invited him to exhibit in our gallery. And it was only at the opening reception that we realized that we had met years ago. And since then, I think, especially during the process of the installation of his work and the editing and selecting, which is something that I love to do, I think we began to realize that there's a lot of overlap with the way that we think and work. On the flip side, we're also both huge pains in the asses, and we call each other out on tons of bullshit. So it was this great amount of tension and collaboration. And then slowly, over the years, I began to work with him on a few of his shows, just from an aspect of a curator, just making suggestions. And slowly, it sort of grew into a collaboration of making work together. I don't know if you want to add to that.
Where did the transgender women and young gay men subjects come in?
Well, that's kind of like a long story. No, what happened is that there are like in time, I think there are a lot of like things just to recover part of the history of like in my life. So I started really young, as a young boy studying different things like painting, sculpture, like different things in art. Then I went to college. After college, I moved to US. But all the time I was living in Peru. So that is like there are a lot of things when you live in a country like mine that it's it just put a lot of like pretty strong points on your brain that you cannot just remove. So it's a society that is like really machismo in my country is like pretty strong. Everything related to sexuality or everything related or everything that is against religious ideas are just bad. So you cannot really behave in the way that you want, being as free as you want to be, just because you will be judged by everybody. So keeping that in mind, while I moved to US, even though I was here for 14 years, I spent a lot of time with myself and trying to understand why all these things happen as just a human being, or why these things keep happening in a country like mine. So, and during all this time, I was already investigating about sexuality, I was investigating about gender, I was investigating about how religion in general can support or destroy certain kind of ideas just for like how powerful they are. So in that time I met Andrew, and then we started working together, and we really fit each other in an amazing way. So because even though we are from two totally different countries, I think that we grew up in a really similar way. And as he said, we do not just feed each other in a good way. We just destroy each other sometimes, and I think that's like it's important as two people and two artists really helping each other as much as they can, and we are really sincere with each other too. So, and I think that's really important. But so there is a point in which my work, like 5 or 6 years ago, started talking about this. The idea of transformation and the idea of destroying everything that you are to become what you really want to be. So like finding the essence of yourself. And all the time Andrew was already working with me. We were again like feeding each other and like exchanging ideas. And we had the opportunity to bring one of my shows to Peru, and that's the moment in which we took the decision, because we were talking about these themes already, and we were discussing all this, but in Peru, when we were over there at the opening night, we just looked at each other and we were like, I think it's time to finally do it, and I think it's time to really start this project, because I think that was the first moment in which I was finally open in my country, not just as a gay man, but as a human being. I could really I was not worried about people judging me for anything, or I wasn't worried, and I was really defensive with a lot of things that I was seeing on the street against not just the LGBTQ community, but against other people, you know, like racist situations, or like situations in which classism was like too strong or too like. So that's when everything basically started. And I think his experience was.
Yeah, I think when we were in Peru, that was November of 2013. When I landed in Peru, it was a bit of culture shock for me. I don't speak Spanish. I butcher the language. But one thing that I can clearly see, it was almost tangible, is how much religion and politics go hand in hand in that country. And so much so that it's a country full of fear in that capacity. And the classism there is so heavy. I know in the Los Chicos work, when you see some of the boys who are nude mostly, a lot of an American audience would think how handsome or beautiful they are. But in Peru, these boys are actually the lower class citizens there who are frowned upon. And I remember one boy specifically saying, he was shocked that we would invite him to be part of this photograph. And I said, well, he said, I'm not a model. I said, I'm not looking for a model, but you're quite handsome. And he said, I'm not handsome in this country. And that sort of stays with me, the idea of beauty and of value based on social class. And this image of Freddie, for example, when we told him about the project and about the fact that we're celebrating the young gay millennials who are finally able to show their faces as gay men, he knew that he will be fired once this work is released from his teaching position, because the school that he teaches at is partially funded by the church. So once the work is out in exhibition in Peru and in book form, there is a chance that he'll be fired, and it's a pretty good chance. So these are things that I was able to learn and see right away, and I didn't. I feel like I'm rambling.
No,
Am I rambling?
But it's so interesting that he went ahead and he thought the cause was more important than his.
It was. For him, it was more important.
Which is very different now. I think the youth there are starting to really shatter these ideas of convention and this fear of the church. So it was important for me to, and it was important for us both in terms of the trans women and the boys, to make sure that we are not objectifying them and to make sure that we are respecting who they are as individuals and not pushing them further than they want to go. Or with the trans women, the idea of the transition of their bodies is really scary to a lot of people, and it's weird to see a woman with a penis. I get it. But after a while, it becomes a non-issue. But some of them were far more open to show certain parts of their body than others, and that was perfectly fine with us. Yeah. So,
like, even that's really interesting what he said, because even I consider myself like a really open mind person. It's like you talk about, like, I don't know, I did this or I did that, or I heard this story or the other one, and for me it's like, okay, whatever, it's not a big deal. So tell me something else. So I just receive information, I filter, and I'm like, everything is okay to me.
yeah.
So, but I have to accept that the first time that we did a shoot of the ladies, and she decided I'm gonna be like fully naked, I reacted in a weird way, and it wasn't a bad reaction, but it was just a little bit shocking. I have to accept it. But I have to accept too that like 3 or 4 minutes later.
Shocking why?
Shocking because I never saw a woman with a penis.
Okay.
That's what it is. That's reality. So, but the most important part, I think, was that we became friends before she decided to go for the shoot, because the shoot was like a month after we met her. And her name is Leila. And she's a beautiful woman. You will see her on the street and you will never tell that she was born as a boy. So, but literally 5 minutes later, 4 minutes later, it was just normal to me. It was like, yeah, it's another body. So one has, I don't know, one is taller, one is shorter, one has boobs, one doesn't. You know, like one has a penis, one doesn't. So one has both. Exactly. So it just became normal. And I think that's one of the reasons why we are, like, the type of photography that we are trying to do with these ladies is trying to create something beautiful, something that through the codes of art, you know, like light and color and composition and the classic poses and everything that we chose for them was so specific that we wanted them to be regal and beautiful and strong at the same time, and I don't know, all these qualities that will make them, you know, just like beautiful, but at the same time showing their bodies, because we need to educate people, and people need to understand that they have the same rights that everybody else have. And you know, in my country, they just do not exist. People prefer not to see them. People push them to the poorest part of the country because they don't want to deal with them. So they don't have options for changing names. They don't have options for an ID. They don't have options for medical care. They don't have options for anything. So, and they're forced to be prostitutes because society do not want to deal with them. So the moment in which you see them or you are able to find them somewhere in the city is in the night. So, yeah.
Thank you. And Meredith, you collaborate too, just to get back to this idea of collaboration, but in a really interesting way. Not, your collaborators are kind of far-flung, right? Mexico and...
Yeah, the Just Seeds Artists Cooperative that I'm a part of has 30 members, and we have members in Mexico, Canada, and all around the U.S. And so there's a lot of different ways in which we collaborate. We work on portfolio projects where we'll work with a social justice organization to create artwork around a specific issue, so around like climate justice or reproductive justice, gender equality. And then we'll also sometimes get asked to do a large-scale installation. So we did one in Slovenia and one in Berlin and one in Milwaukee. This is in Pittsburgh at the Pittsburgh Biennial. So we'll come together to do the large-scale installation work, and then sometimes we'll just work, you know, like 2 or 3 members will work on something together.
And they
as well.
just opt in, kind of?
Yeah,
people
just
say, I want to do that?
Right, so somebody will have an idea for a group project, and then people will decide whether they can or want to be a part of that. And then sometimes it has to do with like the amount of funding that's available or people's schedules. Some people work full-time or part-time jobs. Some people are full-time employed, self-employed artists. So everyone has various levels of commitment.
And do you actually ever meet?
Yes. So we have annual or biennial retreats that so we'll come together and talk about like the finances. We also have an online store where we sell over $100,000 of artwork every year. Like, and most of that's like very affordable art. So things range between $10 and $100. So we sell a lot of like pretty affordable art. So we'll talk about the business, and we'll talk about what kind of projects we want to be a part of, and then sometimes we'll talk about, we got this opportunity to do an installation at Pacific Northwest College of Art, and so earlier this year a bunch of us came together and we had like a mini retrospective of sorts there, so we'll just talk about all this kind of stuff at the retreats. And it's also a way for us to like go swimming and hang out and get to know each other.
And get recharged, right?
Yeah, and get recharged. And there's also like new members. So we started off at like 10 members. So we've tripled our size throughout the year. So so it's also a way to get to know people that like I still haven't met two of the new members. So
very cool.
Yeah.
And just to get back to this, you all use human beings as your subjects. Some of you use cats as well, but the common denominator seems to be human beings. And you know, whether you're recording interviews with them or photographing them or making woodblock prints of them. So how do you gain their trust? You guys started to talk about this a little bit. And how engaged are they in your cause? I'm sure everybody's experience is different. And Dana, I know you can speak to this a little bit, and Anne, with all the mothers or the women that you interviewed as well. Dana, how do you approach your subjects?
First, I just want to acknowledge the other artists. Your work is so extraordinary. It's such an honor to be here with you. I'm very moved because artists often work in a solitary fashion, and it's, unless you're at a university, and I'm so excited to be here with you. I'll just say briefly that my work developed after I graduated from Stanford from shooting advertising portraiture work in the Bay Area and editorial for magazines, all lifestyle portrait work, to journeys that took me around the world, because some of those advertising assignments took me there, as Sarah said, and I would jump to go to do my work because I was near a location and the body of work grew. In the early years of the journeys, my art was ahead of my intellect, and those interactions with people were not always as determined of portrait sessions. I was there with my big Hasselblad camera. If you go upstairs and have time to see the film, sometimes in the next 2 months in the show, you'll see me with the camera that I still work with for 30 years. And the interactions were beautiful, but they weren't that I had selected necessarily in research for a long time, those places. But later in my 20s, I began to really ask myself, why was this LA girl going to all of these indigenous places, and realizing that I wanted to be a bridge person or a steward for the voices of the indigenous peoples and to support their existence on the planet and the important messages that they have for sustainability and how we're going to survive. And so I would carefully choose those locations, always research a guide, usually somebody from that particular remote region that spoke the dialect, and the trips would be arranged where I would go anywhere from a week to several weeks, really with that intention to portrait. Sometimes setting up a camp in certain places for many days to work, setting up portrait studio, meeting the people, the elders, the headmen, the women, the children, and the interactions were beautiful. Always going with reverence and stepping lightly, knowing that I was a visitor in their world, a white woman walking in places of color and foreign places, and that my mission was to have a sense of a cultural exchange and to impart the sense of love that I had for individuals and humanity, and to photograph that sense of dignity, which I feel that I share with all the other artists on this panel. It's a very dignified panel in how you present the work that you do. And rather than to focus on the poverty or the tragedy, to focus on the future, tribes in transition and where we were going. So with that, let me just also say, Sarah, that portrait sessions are very intimate. For me, they are. I really want to go deeply with somebody. I speak constantly in the session. If I have an interpreter, I'm telling them, please tell the subject that I care about them, that I want to show the beauty of their culture, that their image may be seen by other people, and to share that with the world. In the early days, of course, I had no idea that it would become a book, that we would help adopt a UN declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples, that we would really support the work of our elders, our indigenous leaders who for centuries and decades had been working on these issues, and that we would be assisting with that. And so it wasn't as if I could say to people, it's going to be a book in 25 years, or, you know, it's going to be at the UN, or I'm going to speak at Davos. And what I said to the audience last night, and especially for, there's so many students here today, I'm so glad that you came, hopefully for us, not just the delicious food, but that, that it's okay that you don't know who exactly you might want to be right now. Some of you might, but that could change. I was a psychology major and thought I'd go to graduate school, and my senior year shocked my parents and said I'm going to become a photographer. You know, that's the exciting journey, that you don't have a crystal ball. Life would be very boring if we knew exactly who we were going to be in 25 years. So really track that inner spirit and your own personal journey, and listen carefully to those, that still inner voice inside of you. the inner voice that knew in 7th grade, that poster, and
And listen to your dreams, apparently.
Exactly.
And Anne, how did you find that I'm not sure how you went about finding these women, but were they 201 just dying to tell their stories, or did you have to sort of really explain yourself, or was it a mix?
Yeah, in the beginning, I didn't know how to find people.
Yeah.
I had done several autobiographical installations on my own experience of being an adoptee, and in each of those installations I would leave room for other people, a dedicated room for people to write their stories and post them. So I was gathering information, but a lot of the stories that were left by the first moms were left anonymously. But they reconfirmed what I'd heard from this woman in the gallery. So I knew there were stories out there, but I didn't know how to, find the women who might tell the stories. And this would have been, in the 90s. And so then when I actually initiated the oral history project, I, crafted a letter that essentially went out to, it's a little, these stories are long. It's like, how do you make them short? There was an article in the Boston Globe about this project because I'd gotten a Radcliffe Fellowship at Harvard. And when that article about what I was researching, I'd already done some of the interviews, went into the paper, I got, I don't know, thousands of emails from people. I made the mistake. No, I didn't. It wasn't a mistake. I asked the writer to put my email in there. Yeah. And so I got emails from people saying, that happened to my sister, that happened to my mother, that happened to my aunt. And there were excerpts from the interview, so people knew generally what the stories I was starting to collect were about. And so I would write each person back and say, would you be willing to contact them and see if they want to be interviewed? And I did a kind of full disclosure. This is my mission. This is what I'm doing. If you're worried about voice recognition, don't participate, because my mission is to make these stories public. The sad thing was that nobody had ever asked. So people that had never spoken about it, in some cases, they had never told husbands because they were advised not to by every authority figure in their life. They said, I don't care anymore, the truth has to come out. And basically that's what I said, that I wanted the truth of their experience. I wasn't looking for any particular kind of stories. I had no idea when I started what the stories were going to be like. I just wanted to collect as many different stories as possible, and they were eerily similar. And this was from the Deep South, from the Northwest, from New England, from everywhere. They were really, really the same because it had to do with the era, the post-World War II era, and that's a long conversation in itself. But I had a lot of people who had never talked about it. And then I also had people who said they'd been seeing therapists for years, but they had failed to tell them about the experience of losing a child from adoption because they didn't think it was relevant. And as soon as they started talking about it, everything changed. Yeah. Right? It was and these are women from the baby boom generation. They learned to be bold and sort of assertive about everything else in their life, but this one thing, which they were horribly shamed by because everybody made them feel terribly ashamed. And so when they had a chance to talk about it, sometimes I would ask the initial question, and they'd talk for 4 hours. It was a lot of transcription costs. but it was that was the sad part. And they were unaware of that it had happened to so many people themselves, because they felt they were made to feel like they were the only one who'd been the black sheep of the family, who'd almost ruined the family reputation. And so they were, the people who were willing to talk were dying to talk.
Very interesting. Well, I have many more questions, but I wonder if anyone in the audience has questions for these fine artists. Yes?
Ms. Fessler?
Yes.
So you mentioned that you got a lot of emails from people who said that family members had that experience
Yes.
of losing a child to adoption. Did you ever have a chance to talk to the parents of somebody who lost a child to adoption?
No, and because the women, I was particularly interested, I had to put some parameters on my research because I was ultimately going to put these stories in the context of a particular time period, and I needed to know exactly what was going on during that time period. So the era between 1945, the end of World War II, and 73, the passage of Roe, even though Roe isn't the factor that makes the numbers go down, which is, it's really birth control, the availability of the pill to single women. So the women I'm interviewing, their families are mainly, the mothers and fathers of those women are mainly gone now. And so I was focusing on the women themselves, giving them the opportunity to tell their own story, because the stories about them had been told, written, expressed, filmed from the perspective of people who had a vested interest in facilitating an adoption. So their stories about what it was like on the other side were not out there in the world at all. There was not anything out there about their stories. And so, but again, the short answer to your question is the families were really gone. I did hear secondhand through the women about how their families reacted when the child came back into their life, when they had a reunion with the child at age, when their child is like 40 years old and they reunite. And that's actually the first time most of the families ever talked about it again.
I have a question. Have you ever thought of doing the next documentary on the reuniting of some of those families?
No, I do talk about the reunions. They talk about them, and they're relayed a bit in the book. Right now I'm interviewing birth fathers.
Oh, interesting. Amazing.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question for, and it's not directed at any one of you in particular, or all of you, but I see that a theme that I hear from several of you is that you're very desirous to tell a story, that you have different populations and interested in telling a story. But I also hear a theme that there's a social justice concern about being change agents. And I'm wondering if you could just reflect for a minute. I can see telling a story and making something which is authentic as documentation of a group of people. But I don't know how that necessarily is the same thing as being a change agent. And I wonder if you would I could see, I'm a political scientist,
yes.
So that's a bias I have in asking this question. But it's not as political scientist that I just want to know your reflection, how you put together the art of telling a story as opposed to the question of the challenge of being a change agent.
And how do you know it's working?
I think
that's a really good question. I wrote a similar question down as a question to ask everybody. Yeah, yeah. But
I think I hope I can answer this well. But one of the things that was important for me, especially as a white American cis male, going to a South American country and helping them solve a problem. I mean, a friend of mine once said, you know, it's like Doctors Without Borders. They're doing great things, but it's white people pointing out brown people's problems, and that's a legitimate concern or reaction that I've gotten many times. But what I first had to do was change my mentality in the fact that I am part of their community. I am a gay male. They are part of the LGBTQ community, and I don't view us as having a specific border, whether it's cultural or not. I know that there are different cultural stigma and laws and things that we'll have to work around, but ultimately I'm helping people within my own community. Now, having said that, what I also knew, and I don't want to speak for Juan, but what I also knew is that I didn't want to have a National Geographic experience, which is perfectly fine, but I didn't want to just breeze in and breeze out. So by establishing these relationships with these people, it's given me the opportunity to see how the work has not only changed their perceptions on their self-worth and self-value, but also how they've become, especially some of the women, more active in their own community. The trans community in Peru, unlike, I'll just use for example, in Boston, the gay men, you know, when the topic of civil unions and marriage equality was happening in Boston, it was all of us were united together. In Peru, it doesn't happen with the trans community. They're so interspersed throughout the area that they don't come together as a single unit. So when we're photographing some of these women, they're telling us things like, I've never been this respected before. I've never felt this honored before. No one's ever been this nice to me. And slowly through the project, some of the women that we worked with have made connections together. And even on this last trip that we went, we just got back, what, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, they're now working together in community centers and rallying together to reach out to the younger trans women to find a way to educate them on HIV awareness, on options that they can do for their own transition. And a big problem there is the aspect of sex work. And for me, there was a point where I had to realize that if I were in their position, I would do the same thing, because there's not much else for them to do in some instances. So I think we're already seeing a tiny shift. But I also want to mention that I think the backbone of our project is not to first educate the public, it's to first empower these women. And then the B product is educating the public. But I think when you know, Maricielo says, I've never felt this beautiful before, even for that split second, it's wonderful. And that's good enough for me. And I think that will be a catalyst for great work in her life. Juan?
I agree.
You just talk too much.
I did already. Like, why would I do it again?
Did that answer your question?
It's a great question.
Okay.
You
It's
know,
a really
I mean,
good
there must
question,
be
yeah.
moments when you're thinking, this is hard, and is it working? I also think, I wonder, do you ever feel like your art is reaching people who are already in your tribe, or who are like-minded, and is that okay? I mean, do you want it to go beyond the boundaries of your world and your mindset?
I think those kinds of questions are the ones that come up over and over when you do this kind of work. And, you know, is making work about a subject, a troublesome subject, activism? Not necessarily, you know. And I think that one has to sort of figure out, is it more about just making people aware? You know, you can do that through art. You can make people aware, and then what audience is going to see it? You know, so there's a series of questions that come with that. If you want to change minds, that might be a little tougher. If you want to get people to change your behavior, you know, that's even tougher. But certainly a combination of empowering the people that you're working with, and also getting, you know, information out are you know, two different, those are two different, you might need two different strategies for that. And then real activism might have nothing to do with the actual making of the work. It might be that the work puts you in touch with people, and you can support them, and they can support you in doing something that really, you know, is about facilitating change, laws, whatever.
Or UN declaration.
Yes, exactly. And you know, I sometimes am really frustrated and irritated by work that claims to be, you know, socially motivated, when it's really, in a way, it's like, you know, people buy it and they think they've done something. And that's almost worse than, you know, not doing it in the first place. So these are all really, really good questions.
Yes. Oh, Dana, did you want?
Do you want me to answer that?
Were you going to say something?
I was going to say something. Do we have
And then-
time for this
yep,
gentleman to
and then-
ask his question after I?
Yep.
Okay. I was just going to say that it is such a good question. Does the work touch the actual subjects that you're working with? Like your focus initially was that, and then Plan B was to maybe change consciousness from seeing the art. Mine was a blend of all of the above. As I said, the early journeys, I didn't know what was going to happen. Then I started to understand more and more. And then I was asked to create a book on the body of my lifetime work of 25 years in association with Amnesty International for their 50th anniversary. And that's a great time when things like that happen in your life, to know that it's time to seize the moment and try to do the best you can to shape the outcome. And it remained a Dana Gluckstein book, even though it was in association with Amnesty. And I crafted the entire book, bringing in all the arts people that I had worked with for many years, the designers, the art directors, the writers, the editors, even somebody like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who I'd been honored to portrait in South Africa a few years before. I wrote to him and, you know, said, would you consider writing the foreword to this book? And he wrote such an inspirational foreword. And one of my earliest teachers, Faithkeeper Oren Lyons, you'll read about them in the exhibition, who wrote a scholarly introduction about the history of the demise of indigenous peoples and the medieval laws in the Roman Catholic Church. And so I assembled the book, so the art, it kept growing. And when I heard that the United States had vetoed in 2007 the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and 144 countries had voted for it. The U.S. vetoed it with Australia, New Zealand, and Australia. I said, here's my moment and my mission, exactly, Anne, what you were saying. I said, I don't want it to just be a beautiful coffee table book that people that can afford $40 buy as gifts and put it on their coffee table in their home, or art hanging only in museums. I mean, that's beautiful to have that happen, but I really wanted to make a difference. I want this book to make a difference. So I pushed it even further. I made the book all about the UN Declaration. I suggested that we put all the 40 articles of the Declaration had never been published in the back of the art book. So we had the scholarly text, the inspirational text, we had the art. It was kind of a full package. I wanted it to be for, you could give it to your grandmother, you could give it to a younger person, anybody could gift it. And then I wanted to take it even further. I said to Amnesty International, when the book is released, if we're lucky enough to get attention, media attention, let's have people do something. Because people show up and they say, what can we do? How can we make a difference? And we had a letter, you could click on the Amnesty International link, write to President Obama. It was already a letter that said, please adopt the UN Declaration. And indeed he did. We were the last country to do so. The book came out in early November, and in mid-December he gathered our tribal leaders from the US and Alaska to the White House and announced the adoption. So I say that we really stood on the shoulders of our leaders, indigenous leaders that had been working for centuries on these issues, and certainly decades on the UN Declaration, and we helped just a little bit tweak it. We were bridges to help really get the White House to know that non-natives were watching carefully what the United States was doing. I just want to say one quick thing, and then your question is that we have something else that you can all do today, so jot this down in your computers or your cell phones. I approached Amnesty International again a year ago when I knew the exhibition was finishing the tour in Europe and coming to the United States, and said, what can we do again to harness the visuals of dignity? What action is important now? And they were very excited. They said, we have a whole campaign again, a letter to President Obama to implement the sexual assault protocols, to end rape and assaults on reservations in the US and in Alaska. And I'm asking all of you a call to action to join our sisters here on campuses. There's a lot of talk in the last years about rape and assault on college campuses in the U.S. military. It's the same on Native American Alaskan women reservations. More than 1 out of 3 Native women will be raped in a lifetime compared to 1 out of 5. It's all horrible, the violence, but you can take action very quickly. So jot this down. You can either go to the Amnesty International website, or it's a little tricky to find on their site, but you could go to my nonprofit site, which is tribesintransition.org. Take action. That's the name of the show, tribesintransition.org. Quickly sign it, pass it to other people that you know. My mission in the next few years while Dignity tours is to get thousands of signatures going to Obama.
I think that you raise an interesting point. There's just there's like a macro level of change that you can sort of be aiming for or fall into, or get on that bandwagon. And then there's this micro level of change, which is when you touch someone's life, another human. So art, and then there's everything in between.
Everything in between, and it's all so important. So you can act locally, personally, globally, nationally, whatever your heart calls out to, and all of you carry a piece of that puzzle.
Thank you. Now, would you like to ask your question?
He forgot his question now.
There's a lot of questions that I'm really interested about how different resources get accrued around this work and redistributed, but I have a very specific question for Meredith. Can you talk about the relationship of text in your work or to your work? Because, and I guess also with Just Seeds, like a lot of work is using very explicit text, but much more kind of like poetic imagery. And can you just talk about how you understand that?
Yeah, sometimes the text directs the piece, and sometimes the imagery connects or drives the piece. Yeah, didactic versus subtle is like an ongoing conversation with all of the members of Just Seeds. So we all kind of have various approaches to that question, because it's definitely. And it kind of ties into like who is the audience for the piece and what is the intent. And so a lot of times with the pieces that have a lot more words to them, the audience is for people who generally already like believe in that and kind of like need something to, need to feel like they're not alone. So it's like there's other people who feel like I feel this piece is like expressing like what I feel very deeply. And then the subtle work tends to be like more questioning, so and open to interpretation in a way that hopefully allows people to kind of get somewhere more slowly, or if they're not necessarily already, thinking the exact same way, or but I kind of think of all of our work together as a quilt. So like all the pieces independently. Can be beautiful or powerful, but all together, then you get a lot more meaning and depth from the work when they're all positioned together. And so that's like where I think the greatest strength of having a various range of work comes into play, is when it's positioned together, and then you can see like how the subtle work is addressing those same issues of inequality and justice, and some of the more, and also a lot of the more visually driven and non-text-based pieces tend to also either like kind of delve into like utopia or like futurism in a way that some of the text-based pieces kind of deal with like what is now, like that we're facing, and like what are the specific issues that we're looking at.
How many of you consider yourselves activists? And artists? Any artists? Great. Does anyone have any questions about advice they might like from these artists on how to?
I wasn't going to ask so much about advice, but to the political science question, I was thinking that one thing I love about the integration of the artwork here at the Watson Institute is that idea of various ways of conveying and understanding information, and it's sort of clicked to me, how often do political scientists think, if they're on a project, think I need to partner with an artist to help convey this issue? Because just like Juan Jose was saying, when they are thinking about how they want to present their subject, artists' minds are thinking about how do people respond to color, how do people respond to imagery, how do people respond to composition, because these are other ways of thinking, valid ways of conveying knowledge and information that are just different, and they help people to understand these deep issues in a different way. And sometimes I think people don't understand how deeply artists dig into how synonymous artists' projects are with serious research.
Or how long it takes to write a book.
And how artists just convey, and it almost starts to feel like a paper, like a white paper, would have a completely different impact if paired with imagery, and that marriage of the social sciences or the political sciences with artistic imagery is not strange at all. It seems like it's kind of necessary. So I just wanted to throw that out there as an addition to that.
It's a really good point. I think that brings up this issue of visibility. And I mean, it sort of goes without saying that history is supposed to be the sum total of all histories, right? Of all people's, individuals' histories should be our history. But we all know that that's never the case. It's the people in power who write history and who convey history. And as a person who's an academic, I have a healthy distrust of academia and research that's about other research. It's about other research, and I feel like it's incredibly important to look. And I think everybody here is trying to make some aspect of the world more visible, because we all see it as something that's not being addressed in the media, in academia, in the larger world in general, that people don't understand, and that we're trying to, use our platform as artists to make it visible. I think that's what everybody here seems to have in common.
Yeah, and that's resonating with me, this impulse to create a space for voice. And, well, of course, we have time maybe for one more question? I know you guys have classes. Yes, Alex.
Hi, I was up in the overflow room, so just ran down now.
Welcome.
So nice to be here. I wanted to ask, I heard a lot of you talk about sort of placing certain creative constraints on your projects initially as a way to sort of perhaps open up more space to dive deeply into a topic. So for Anne, I know that was choosing to focus on birth mothers, and in the other project area you're talking about sort of the composition and light of your images and the classical poses that you used. And I actually run a program here called Storytellers for Good, which is for students who are producing digital stories with social impact at Brown. And something I see a lot of students run into time and time again is like the difficulty in creating those constraints, when part of your goal is also sort of that empowerment and freedom of the person you're working with. So I was curious how you balance those two things. How do you sort of determine what your creative constraints are going to look like initially in your project, and then how do you sort of balance that with also the goal of empowering and allowing that person to express themselves fully?
I think for us it's editing. I think editing is the most important part of image making, and I think what we do is we bounce back and forth ideas, we create sketches, we think about the different components that the image should have. In some instances, or in most instances, when we meet the person we will photograph, we try to incorporate parts of them into it. So it's this big sort of bowl of information that we want to separate and prioritize and find a way to create this clear moment and a clear, beautiful moment for what I think we're doing. There's a couple artists that I sort of look at a lot of the times when I think about editing, and one is Luba Lukova, who's an illustrator designer in New York who did a portfolio on social justice years ago. And in terms of editing, she's become such a master. Just a couple lines, 1 or 2 words of text, and all of a sudden the image is there. And for somebody who does poster work of that type, she's mastered that as far as I'm concerned. And the other person I look at is Käthe Kollwitz, a German expressionist printmaker who, even if you can't read German, the imagery is so powerful and strong that it defies any types of communication. But in both of those cases, it's getting down to the root of it. It's not complicating it.
I have similarities with that because my camera of choice for the fine art work was a Hasselblad, which is an old-fashioned square format at 2 1/4 inches by 2 1/4. That square format is very different than the rectangle that all of you are most familiar working with, especially now with iPhones, and it's a tough format. It took time to work with it, but it's the one that I love best. And also choosing to work with real film and black and white has been very interesting, because the times they are a-changing, and I can't get the Polaroid that I used to work with. I can't get, I'm hoarding lots of film in my refrigerator because Kodak doesn't make my film anymore. And I don't know what I'm going to do when they don't make it, but I guess I'll cross that bridge. But many people have asked, why don't you shoot in color? If you see the film that's playing, looping upstairs, you'll see some documentary footage of me actually shooting that's in color, and then the click, and then the final edited image. And it's shocking to see what it looked like in color, and then the editorial choice of the black and white. But I just stuck with it because I felt that the black and white was very soulful, and that we're inundated with color images in advertising and editorial work, especially in my genre, not with what you're doing. You've created an entirely new genre based on history. It's extraordinary what you've done, the different iconic kinds of images and Renaissance poses and all of that. So sometimes those are tough choices because, yes, I would be in a place and think, it's so beautiful and Bhutan in color. Am I crazy that I didn't bring color film? But I have to stay very disciplined and focused, especially if you're creating a body of work. That is, you know, the body of work has to have some consistency to it.
You had a question.
Yes, really quickly, this is for Andrew and John. Have you had any conversations with the LGBTQ people you've photographed that despite the way that their church or government has treated them, still considers themselves religious?
I think I'll say something that I think is really interesting. And I'm going to use the word funny. Like the funniest part of that, the whole situation is that even though the Catholic Church in my country do not want them even to exist, these people is really Catholic. You know? They're like it's like crazy, and I'm gonna tell you like a little story, like how everything began, like, because it began like 15 years ago, the year like 15 or like 18 years ago when I graduated from college. A friend of mine told me a story, and that's the reason why this series is called Virgins of the Door, Vírgenes de la Puerta. That it's about a statue that was taken from some part of Peru to Lima and was adopted by this community. And this community used to go to church every Sunday, used to pray every day, and used to do all these things. And the community was a trans community. So there was a problem at the time, that was in like the 80s. There was a problem at the time when the Catholic Church knew that the priests in the church allowed them to do that. So this virgin, and they took the statue in an anda, you know, to the street once a year. So they were doing all the processes that other churches do with their statues, and everything was perfect until the Catholic Church decided to say no. Like, they are not allowed even to be there. You know, there are trans people. It's like, what's the problem here? And even with that, they still believe, and they still fight for it, and they still, even until now, it's like they go to church on Sundays, you know, like.
But there's one important point to make that's different from the U.S. that I didn't even realize until I got to Peru, is that in the U.S., if you're gay, you're trans, whatever, it's pretty much a blanket idea that if you go to New York City, you go to Boston, you go to Providence, you go somewhere, there's going to be resources for you and other people like you. If you live in Cowtown, whatever, more than likely you're probably not going to be as accepted. In Peru, it's the exact opposite. You can go to smaller villages up into the mountains, and trans people and gay people are living in total harmony with everybody else. There is no discrimination. They are actually revered in some of those communities. The reason why in Lima or other major parts of Peru that they are being attacked and or marginalized is because the Catholic Church has such a strong presence in those cities. So they're really pushing them aside. So it's interesting, even in our research traveling through Peru, that we can go into, we actually did see a religious procession just outside of Lima that was full of trans women, and it was no problem. Had that procession taken place in downtown Lima, there would have been a huge problem.
Yeah.
They would have been arrested, absolutely.
That's a great question.
And yet they still remain devout, because I think their spirituality, like I hope everyone's spirituality, will defy laws that man has made or manipulated, my opinion.
Yes, one last question, and we have to.
This goes back to the intertwining of politics and religion. And it's very interesting, you talked about the countryside versus the city. It's reversed of the United States. Is that because of the liberationist theology that's occurred in the countrysides with the poor people, the indigenous peoples? That there's a divergence in between being really Catholic and believing people are people and we accept them and they have their faith as best as possible.
I think actually, and I could be wrong, so I'll jump in and then maybe you could answer. I think the majority of the native cultures in Peru, prior to the Spaniards arriving and ruining everything, did accept it. It wasn't a part of that type of discrimination was never part of the equation. And you could see even now figurines and huacos made by Inca people where two men are engaging in sex, as well as male and female figures. It's something that was done. Gender identity, I'm not exactly sure, but I'm assuming it had its place there. But I think up until colonialism, that's what changed.
So when you go in Peru, what happened in Peru is that there are just like 4 big cities. It's not like the United States where you go, like any state has like downtown is like a big city somehow one way or the other. Over there it's not. So it's like countryside or these 4 big cities, that's it. Even though there are like different states. So you move around the country and the beliefs that they have, even though you see a church, there are towns that they have to put like Ayacucho, like 20 church, 20 different buildings in the same tiny town, because there were places where and I think art comes to that I think is interesting. The creation of art was so strong, and they were so against the Catholic Church, not against the church because they were crazy, just because they had their own beliefs before Spaniards took South America. That they were fighting too much with that. So it's basically putting a building on top of an Indian or an Inca structure to repress one thing and put the other one instead. So that's what we're trying to do. And again, going back to the countryside against the city, in Lima you see churches everywhere. And in these towns you don't. So the type of belief, and the best sample is the Peruvian forest, the border with Brazil. You don't see churches over there. It's really weird to find one. And the acceptance of the biggest trans community that we have in my country comes from there. They are like, you see them everywhere, and they behave in the way that they want, and they are fully accepted, and nobody cares. So and the power that, going back to power between the Catholic Church and the politicians in my country, there are a lot of issues about that right now. Like the Catholic Church is giving money to politicians to go against certain laws. So that's how bad the situation is.
We could have another whole seminar about how religion affects the things that we're talking about.
Part 2 tomorrow.
Shame. I just want to thank you all. I want to urge everyone to go upstairs and see the photos. Go on the Just Seeds website. Go on everybody's website. Google them. They're not. I don't think all the websites are on the sheet. But I just really want to say thank you to everybody, and I hope we can bring you back. Thank you.
Shame. Thanks, Anna.